Thoughts on the Bible readings: 2 Samuel 14, Jeremiah 18 and Romans 1-2 for July 28. 2 Samuel 14 speaks of how Joab was able to make a plan for Absalom to be brought home from his exile in Geshur. Joab sought to restore himself to David, knowing that the king's heart was longing for Absalom's return. So Joab approached a wise woman from Tekoa to pretend to be a mourner who sought the king's judgment on a vexing problem. Having pretended to David that her 2 sons had fought, and one of them had died, and the magistrate of her region was insisting that the murderer be slain. The woman said that if this happens, she will be childless. King David promised her protection from retribution. How true were the wise woman's words! We all are like water spilled on the ground that cannot be gathered again. Then, after the king had promised to protect her son, she confronted the king with the inconsistency of his determination. Why do you not act in the same way and protect your son Absalom? David discerned that the exercise had been planned with the woman by Joab. The king agrees to let Absalom's banishment end. She also praises David's wisdom and discernment, and says, "May God be with the king." Verses 21-24 tells us that David sent for Joab to arrange Absalom's homecoming. When Absalom returned home, the king had no communication with him and effectively put Absalom in home detention. This continued for 2 years. Verses 25-27 speak of Absalom's natural beauty and his pride. These verses say that Absalom had a magnificent head of hair that he had cut once a year. Absalom had 3 sons and 1 daughter, Tamar. His daughter was the one who had been defiled by her uncle Amnon. Those events and Amnon's murder at the hands of Absalom are referred to in chapter 13. Absalom could not tolerate being excluded from the king's court, so he sought for Joab to come and arrange for his acceptance by his father. Because Joab didn't respond to Absalom's summoning him, Absalom had his own servants set Joab's fields on fire. The irate army captain came to Absalom and facilitated Absalom's restoration to David's favor. But Absalom had now made a bitter enemy who in time to come would exact his revenge on David's son. In Jeremiah 18 we are told one of the greatest lessons as to how the Almighty makes people and teaches us that He alone has the right to choose and the right to reject. We, the clay in the master potter's hands, cannot question His choices or His right to exercise His will. Jeremiah 18 verses 1-4 tells us that the prophet is told by God to go to the house of the potter. Here he watches the potter skillfully and laboriously shape a vessel only to smash it and start again to reform it. In verses 5-11 the prophet is told that what he has seen reflects God's prerogatives and choices with nations and individuals. He may do as he wills and no one has the right to question him. And for the nation of Judah they are to be smashed by the Babylonians. Verse 12 tells of the rebelliousness of the nation, which was of course the source of their calamities. Verses 13-17 show that Judah's behaviors are contrary to what is learned from nature. And so the Lord would scatter them out of His land. Verse 18 reveals that the leaders set out to slander Jeremiah. Verses 19-23 say that their sovereign will recompense them for the evil done to his faithful prophet in addition to their treachery against Yahweh. The Apostle Paul in Romans 9, where he speaks of the doctrine of divine election, i.e. selection, talks of the lessons from Jeremiah 18 that the Almighty chooses for reasons we may not know. And that we can never, since we are but the clay, question why, or what, He chooses. Romans 9 verses 6-33. Read these carefully and meditate on the lessons for you. Additional thoughts can be found in 2 Timothy 2 verses 19-21. Let us diligently follow the Lord's ways, His predetermined acceptable pattern of life. In the book of Romans we have one of the 3 most masterful treatments as to how God saves, often called either the atonement or reconciling, the others being Galatians and Hebrews. This book says it tells us about Jesus the Christ, who was declared to be the Son of God by the power of His resurrection. Romans 1 verse 4. Note the frequent use of Christ in the first 8 verses. One of the great themes of the book are the obedience of faith, i.e. that obedience will be the fruit that springs from a vibrant faith. Verse 5. This idea is reiterated at the end of the book, chapter 16:25-27. The first chapter introduces us to the gospel of God, i.e. the joyful message that it is the desire of the Almighty Creator to help us through our belief, or faith, to become His children and the inheritors of the kingdom. Paul's thesis is explained in verses 16 to 17, namely that the gospel is God's power to save all who believe, since the OT declared in Habakkuk 2 verse 4, "The just shall live by faith." Romans 1 verses 18 to 32 speak of God's wrath on unrighteousness, particularly in this chapter in the Gentile world. And this theme is developed further in chapter 2, where Paul shows that the Gentile world is both guilty and without any excuse. Romans 1 verses 18 to 25 reveal that our omnipotent Creator has provided indisputable evidence of His power, so that willfully ignorant sinners stand condemned by their reprobate behavior. By failing to accept the evidence that the Almighty puts before the world of His creative power and Godhead, they are self-condemned and have degenerated, just as their concept of their own origins is also corrupt. Professing themselves to be wise showed that they were, in fact, fools. We find that base beliefs lead to base behaviors. The Apostle Paul speaks of the abominable ways that have been declared acceptable to contemporary society. If God says a thing is wrong, it remains wrong regardless of what the majority of society may believe. Consider the catalog of evil behaviors follow from an acceptance of a corrupting lifestyle. In Romans 2 verses 1 to 5, Paul tells us that those who fail to stand, whether Jew or Gentile, for their sovereign's truth are without excuse. The apostle says that these individuals are building up a store of wrath in the day of judgment. Verses 6 to 11 explain that since God is just, so will His judgment be. Either we by our beliefs and way of life are seeking immortality, i.e. eternal life, or we are going to receive retribution and rejection. In chapter 3, the apostle will turn his attention to the Jews who are gloating over Paul's attack on the Gentiles. But before he does that, he will condemn Jewish hypocrisy and declare that Jews who boast in the law are condemned by their law because of their actions which are contrary to the spirit of the law. And even some of the Gentiles who know not God's law are better in their behavior than those who claim to be the children of God.